September has arrived. Cooler temperatures, football season, pumpkin spice latte. Yay! And this is my second week on the podcast being in the New Testament. I have so much to tell you. I've got to go fast. So here we go. Welcome to this podcast, Living on the Edge of Art. I'm Stella Burkhalter, and I'm going to be talking this week about the book of Mark, the gospel that I've read, and I hope that you will jump with me into the New Testament, even if you're just starting here. It's so exciting to know that there are some people who are reading along or who are reading because of this podcast. I was so excited to see a post from my friend Sherry and to hear from people that they're listening. Okay, I had to stop for a second. My neighbor is leaf blowing. Welcome to the world of low rent podcasting. Anyway, I saw that someone downloaded my Genesis podcast, and maybe somebody's inspired to listen and start from the beginning of the Bible. So, yay! Welcome. So, the Gospel of Mark is the shortest, the most action-packed. I've often compared it to kind of an action movie in the way Mark tells the story. This was the gospel that we used in seminary when we were learning Greek. And right away, there was one Greek word that jumped out because it was there so often. I didn't have to look it up after a while because I learned it. It was everywhere. It was the word euthys. Suddenly, immediately. Everything in the Gospel of Mark happens fast. Suddenly, immediately, everything happens fast. Mark uses that word 41 times as opposed to 87 times in the whole rest of the New Testament. So half the times that word is used almost come from Mark. Even sometimes when you notice in translation, the translators just take it out, like enough already, Mark, enough with the suddenlies. And so I've often thought about how this gospel dynamite. So on my canvas, I kind of tried to paint explosions and cosmic things. But it's so fascinating how in Bible study, there's just so many layers and you think you know it, and there's always something more to learn. Many years ago, I read this book, Scripting Jesus by Michael White, and he talks about the gospel writers as storytellers, how each of them has a story to tell. And so that's when I first started really trying to look at the gospels by themselves instead of kind of a blend of the Jesus story. I ended up wanting to throw this book across the room because he's kind of a heretic. I'm not sure he believes that Jesus really is the Son of God. But it's an example of how it's helpful to read different things because it opens your mind to different things when you have a base and a community to help kind of draw you in when you wander off. It also can lead you to seek different information. And so when I read this book by an English woman named Paula Gooder, The Risen Existence, The Spirit of Easter, this caught my eye because it's a devotional book for after Easter. And she makes the point, which I found to be so true, that there's so many devotional books for Lent. People will say, I'm going to do this for Lent or that for Lent or read these things. And then Easter comes, yay! And we put it down and we don't study anymore. And I was so inspired by this book that I've preached it 2 or 3 times at different churches, looking at the Easter story from each gospel. And I got braver when I preached it at Bethany. I actually got a red candle and made it look like a stick of dynamite and lit it with a sparkler in there. So it looked like I was holding dynamite. Yeah, I know, maybe too cutesy, but what are you going to do? Mark is dynamite. And as I read through it, I got a little insight into what all that dynamite might be about. I'd love for you to just pick up and read the Gospel of Mark this week. It's not hard. It's short, as I said. But these emphasis not just on what Mark says, but on who Mark is as a storyteller, has led me to do a lot of research and to be interested in and want more than just the footnotes in my Bible. So Mark appears in the book of Acts, and we learn that he traveled with Luke and with Paul, and so he would have been exposed to the gospel with and through them. He had one parent who was Jewish and one parent who was Greek, which may not seem like a big deal to us, but in the ancient world, groups of people were so divided, and they stayed in their camps and their clans. And so I wonder what it must have felt like to him. As a person who grew up on the border, I've always felt like, especially when I came to Austin, that I was kind of a half and half person and could move between these two worlds. I'm interested in that about Luke. Maybe I've always just kind of been a person who's lived on the edge. But Luke lived in Jerusalem. And so we learn that the early church met in his house. And it's possible, it's likely that he encountered Jesus himself, that he saw Jesus face to face, that he was a witness to some of these things. And he was a witness certainly to the way Jesus changed people's lives, the way Jesus turned the world upside down. Many of us have just been raised always knowing about Jesus and who he is from childhood. But to encounter him, I think sometimes we get a watered down Jesus. And Mark saw the full power of that. And so he wrote about that. It's been said that the Gospels are really just stories of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and everything else is just a long introduction. And so when you think about all of these things together, you realize that maybe all these suddenlies and immediatelys are Mark wants to get to the meat. He knows he needs to tell you things, but he wants to get to the really important part, the most important part. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. And so you can read it that way. As I said before, I'm challenging myself in this read through the New Testament to read each book in one sitting and think about the fullness of it as a way to see it maybe with different eyes, to hear the storyteller and to put myself in the story in a different way. And so one of the things that I noticed on this reading is to move past my simple assumption about things moving fast and to realize that Mark doesn't tell the birth story, tells so many of the parables shorter or with less surrounding material. He gets to the point really fast. And maybe that's not so much that he's in a hurry, but that he wants to get to the heart of the matter. The other thing I noticed is there are demons everywhere. So many demons. And I want to talk about that a little bit too. So I've been thinking about demons lately. There was another school shooting, quite disturbing. And one of the things in the news about the school shooter was his journals, the things he said about himself and the world around him. And he drew a doodle, he drew a picture in his journal of himself looking in the mirror. So it's him from the back. And in the mirror is a demon with horns, just this ugly beast. And that image is seared in my brain. So disturbing and so sad. And so true and so real. I tend to be kind of a person who wants to focus on science and what we can know for sure. I'm a little uncomfortable with the supernatural. And yet the Bible says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities and darkness. It's real. I'm preparing for a sermon this weekend in Mason, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit, about evil and where it comes from, as I'm going to be talking about the weeds and the wheat, which is still captivating me this week. But Jesus confronts the demons in Mark, and you can say that these are diseases, or you can say, well, that's Jesus and that's not us. It's hard to know what to make about all these demons, but I'm committed in this read through of the Bible, this walk with you, to just listen and see what it stirs up and see what God might say for my life. And when I think about how much time I'm spending alone lately and how that's so out of my nature, to not be connected to a community, I realize how often those dark thoughts grip me, and that demons are real in some way, in some sense. Absolutely. And so Jesus casts out the demons, and he curses the people who lead little children astray and say it's like a millstone is tied around your neck and thrown into the sea. It's worse than that for you when you lead innocent little children astray. And as we think what went wrong with that young man who did the shooting, how have we played into allowing the dark forces to roam free because we don't want to upset people? We ask God, why don't you root the evil out of the world? Like in that parable from last week, why don't you do it? And God says, why don't you? There's evil around you. There's evil and darkness in your own heart. Why don't you root it out in ways that you can? Because I've empowered you to. And so I'm thinking about that. So I'm going to read to you some things from the Gospel of Mark that really got my attention this week, that maybe they might get your attention too. This is from Mark chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath so they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, come forward. Then he said to them, to the Pharisees, to the crowd, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger, and he was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. I'd read that before. I'd read that Jesus cured this man, as he cured many in the Gospels, but I'd never noticed that he's about to cure someone and he looks around in anger. We often think about that scene where Jesus overturns the tables in the temple, and that's the example of anger. But I heard a lot of anger and frustration in this Gospel of Mark, right before Jesus acts in pure love and goodness and grace. He's looking around in anger, the forces of evil around him, forces of evil that come in the form of faithful people. And so Jesus, it says a little bit on in this chapter that Jesus had cured many, so that all who had diseases pressed upon to touch him. Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and shouted, you are the Son of God. He was so struck by how the demons bow down. The demons know him and bow down. I was also struck by chapter 7, and where the Pharisees are giving Jesus a hard time about how he eats. In chapter 7 of the Gospel of Mark, you see that again, that the Pharisees are just following him around, looking for ways for him to mess up. And I think in our reading of the Bible, the word Pharisees is a terrible slur, you Pharisee. But these were simply the religious people of the day. And when I look at exchanges on Twitter, it's Christians doing this to other Christians, just looking for ways to catch somebody in messing up, and factions of Christians fighting against other Christians. And Jesus says, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandments of God and hold to human tradition. Ouch. In Mark chapter 10, James and John start discussing which one of them gets to sit next to Jesus, or who will get sit next to Jesus in eternity. And he says, when the 10, so the other disciples hear this, and they're not too crazy about this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." I'm holding on to that phrase. It is not so among you. It is not so among you. We're supposed to be different. We're supposed to not want to be sitting at the front, having the place of honor. Ouch. Mark then goes and spends a lot of time in Jesus's final days, and one of the things Jesus says as the plot thickens and they're trying to arrest him and things start to unfold, he says, "Keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come." So it's like a parable where the servants are waiting for the master. He says, "Or else he might find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake." And so I am trying to keep awake in this reading of the gospel. I noticed in chapter 6, when Jesus was walking on the water, it says he intended to just pass them by. What's that about? He walks past. Sometimes it feels as if God is not with us. And another thread that is woven throughout Mark, what's called the Messianic secret, where Jesus tells people not to tell about him. What's up with that? And so as I struggle with these things, these questions, these riddles, these parables, these things that seem so ancient, like casting out demons, I'm trying to pay attention. I'm trying to think about what the Gospels say instead of what I think they say. And that's a bit of a challenge. And so I'm going to keep reading. I hope you're going to keep reading with me. I love it when I hear from people who, even if you're just listening to a little bit, even if you remembered something from a long time ago, I love to hear that there's connection between us, that I'm not crazy in doing this all by myself, but that all of us are walking the walk together, even though we're not face to face. And so I'll continue walking on the edge of art, and I hope to see you soon. See you next week.